Hello and welcome to another edition of Flanking Thoughts. We're continuing on with our step-by-step going through the chapters of Lessons of a Decade by Frederick Whitaker. Again, we have Mr. Bob O'Neill with us to keep going through these chapters with his expertise, and I like the back and forth that we've had over the past few chapters. If you haven't seen those, please, we'll link them up here. Click on those, take a look at those videos, and see what you like, and of course, like them, subscribe, and we'll go from there. So today we're going to do one of the chapters, actually is one of the more lengthy chapters that Whitaker has, is what he titles organization. Now, when I was starting to read it, I was like, oh, the organization, because the Army of the Potomac, especially the Cavalry Corps, you hear this traditional, I guess, narrative of they really stunk in the beginning and they were reorganized and just dominated the later part of the war. And so I was really interested to see what he had on that. However, that chapter ended up not being at all right. what I thought it would be, because what he does, in fact, his main focus is really not at all with how the Cavalry Corps was organized, how I think of organized. He basically makes it into a micro focus, I guess what I would say, of, I guess he prefaces it with the idea that America is generally, he says, will not tolerate a standing army. And because of that, anytime we need cavalry or infantry, or we need to raise troops, it'll be out of the civilian population, in which we would need to train, equip, and get going as quickly as possible. And so really his entire narrative is saying that it's basically required to recruit from the civilians that already have horses. And that's his whole premise with organization. What was your initial thoughts on this chapter?
Well, my initial thoughts are similar to yours. It's not exactly where I would have thought he was going to go with it.
Right.
We think of organization probably as how the cavalry was combined in brigades and
Exactly.
divisions.
That's what I was thinking.
That kind of a thing, getting into the cavalry corps. And it's not that. And I think he has a point, because the history of the country was that the expense of cavalry always meant that it was brought along in need or time of conflict, and then because of the expense it was let go.
Yeah.
And so you're always starting from scratch. And there would be some benefit probably to having some kind of a cadre, even if you didn't keep, a huge army, that you had some kind of a cadre to help train when they came back on. But the nation is, originally formed on the idea of a civilian, army, the way he talks about. And I think he had reason to think that it was going to continue. We've always cut back the army. We cut back the army drastically, almost too far. Right. Some would say that we did cut it back too far after the Civil War, and we did it in years after that. So he's got some valid points, but then when he gets on into some other aspects of what he talks about,
and we'll talk about
I think he gets. I would just say that I take a little exception to him.
And so what he actually says is he compares, or I guess one of his main reasons, or I guess reasonings, is that he compares or contrasts the Southern Cavalry from the Northern Cavalry, and at least according to him, the major reason why the Southern Cavalry dominated early in the war was because of the narrative that we always hear, that they were horsemen to begin with. They already had their horses. They knew how to take care of them. And so you didn't have to teach those troopers horse care and basic horsemanship. They already had that. You could just teach them how to be soldiers. So what he goes on to say is, he actually says, at its inception, the Southern Cavalry were far superior to that of the North, born in a country where roads were bad and wheeled vehicles were rare, except heavy wagons and old lumbering stagecoaches, almost unknown. The Southerners, as a rule, made all their excursions for business or pleasure on horseback. And then he goes on to say, in the North, the rule was reversed. Buggies are the rule and riders the exception. Thus it will be seen that a nation of good riders started with great advantage over those who did not have good riders. And so again, that he kind of prefaces the whole chapter by saying the South was dominant because they already knew how to ride. What are your thoughts on that?
Undoubtedly, I'll get myself in trouble with some of your viewers here.
Right.
I'm not going to disagree with him entirely on that. I think there's a valid point to what he's saying, but that storyline has been taken to the point of cliche, I believe, almost. That no one in the North knew how to ride. So I don't believe that everyone in the North rode a buggy. There was more expense involved in it. So if you're getting a regiment raised in an urban area like New York City, and most of the men are coming from the city, they were going to have less experience riding. And it's true that the North, one of their advantages was we had more factories, we had more jobs of that nature, where the South was a more agrarian economy, so there was more land, open land, and so that works to his point. But that wasn't the rule across the North. I mean, the North was not one big urban area. So where if we focus on New York City, that's just one small part of a much larger state, which was still very, very rural, very rugged in many areas. So I don't know that that's. I just don't know that I agree with all these men coming from across the country to Michigan and Ohio, the western part, that they didn't know how to ride.
So he goes on. He actually compares the first year of the war to then a specific instance in the third year of the war. So regarding the first year of the war, he says the Northern cavalry were well armed at that period as far as revolvers went, which actually goes back to our previous episode on weapons and not having all three weapons, but they had revolvers early in the war. And he says the Southerners, many of them, carried only double-barreled fowling pieces with buckshot. Again, kind of another cliche that we talked about. And yet that first year was fruitful of instances where whole squadrons of Northern cavalry were taken prisoners. Then he goes on to say the second year of the war passed away with the Northern cavalry still in a slow, despondent, but slowly improving. And then he says, in the third year, they suddenly came out and beat their old masters. And I find it interesting the verbiage he uses as far as being the Southerners being their old masters. And he says, the Southerners had taught them how to fight on horses, and they had learned to ride in the best of all schools, meaning the one of active service. So we kind of already talked about this just a few minutes ago before this episode, but from Southerners knowing how to ride and Northerners being taught by the Southerners, is that the truth? Or, I mean, what do you think about that?
I think there's some validity to it. I think I would say it would be like the discussion we had on the use of the saber, that you build confidence and you learn confidence when you are putting it into practice where your life's on the line, more so than on the drill field even.
Yeah.
So even if you knew how to ride, it doesn't necessarily mean, and you'll know this better than I do, that you knew military riding, where they may have learned. The Army taught them a certain way to ride, whether it's how they were. So what little I know by reading, not by actually doing. Civilian riders often use both hands, let's say, on the reins. Horses would learn that. The military would teach them to ride with the reins in one hand, so you had the other hand free to use your weapon or whatever. I think they taught them more how to guide a horse with your knees in some cases. So that's probably, there were some things they were going to have to learn that was going to help them on the battlefield. It doesn't mean they didn't know how to ride.
Yeah.
It was a different way to ride. And so to that point, the more you do that in combat and the more you survive that, it's going to build a skill and a confidence level in you that will help.
Yeah.
The idea was that, and you hear this so many times, I think it loses some value. But the timeline seems to prove it, is that it was going to take 2 years to train a cavalryman. And so when you come in and you look at the timeline, then it gets to 1863, and you go, there's the 2-year timeline, right. And that's what it took. But there's a lot more to it than that as well.
Yeah, so that brings up the question is again, the narrative that we, on the shallow level of Civil War history, you hear that the South dominated because of this reason. I mean, how much do you think was it because the South already knew how to ride, already had the horses, and the North didn't know how to ride versus maybe something else? I mean, what other reasons are there for the South dominating early in the war versus the North not?
I think pure and simple, it's a matter of leadership.
Okay, so you think
It's
okay.
a mindset. The South always figured, and I don't know if this is as the underdog. Let's say
Yeah.
I don't know that the South even looked at themselves as an underdog, but you were going to have to do things a little differently. You know, if you're in an underdog role, then you have to take more risks or more chances, probably. I don't think they ever hesitated to recognize that they needed cavalry and that they were going to use cavalry as well as into every advantage that they could. The North started out with a completely different mindset. We're going to roll over the South. It's going to be a short war. It takes time to raise cavalry. It takes a lot of money to raise cavalry. There's a figure that gets, you see, kind of used rather routinely, that a cavalry regiment would cost about $200,000 back in 1861 to raise. Well, it was a lot of money. And if you were going to win the war quickly, like they thought they were going to, then why spend the money? So they start out with a completely different mindset. They don't win the war quickly, so now they've got to start looking at more cavalry, expanding the army. But now you have an officer in George McClellan, a regular Army officer, who had some bad experiences with volunteers, as a lot of regular Army men did in the war with Mexico.
Right.
I'm not an authority on the war with Mexico, but there are any number of accounts from regular Army officers disparaging their experience with volunteers. McClellan didn't have any faith that he was going to be able to train cavalry officers in a short period of time if they didn't have any kind of a officer background.
Right.
So he put his faith in the regulars. He did band the regulars together. He didn't just spread them out entirely, but he kind of shunted the volunteers aside. But that was where the majority of the cavalrymen were going to come from during the
definitely.
war. So you have that mindset. We don't have time to train leaders. We don't have time to train the men. And as you know better than I do, an infantryman learns from one manual.
Yeah.
A cavalryman learns from another, but it's a much longer training program.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's the school of the soldier on horseback. It's the school of the soldier on foot. They're learning different weapon drills.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot more to
more
learn.
Yeah.
So you can see right away, just in that context, there is a longer learning curve. Well, somebody had to be there to teach them how to do that. And that was where the officers and the non-commissioned officers were going to come in. And they didn't have a cadre to come in and do that. They didn't have, just like he said, and we said in the opening, that there was a benefit to bringing in men who could already do that. Everybody essentially in the volunteers was learning from scratch,
right,
with a much more complicated manual. And so there's this sifting process to figure out who could do it and who couldn't. Then in the latter part of 1861, they start saying, the government says, look, we've probably overstepped in terms of hiring or enlisting cavalry.
Yeah.
We're going to muster them out. So now you're actually taking guys who are just starting to get into the system, and you're going to muster them out and send them back to the cavalry or the infantry, or send them home. So there goes your morale. And then things still don't go well. Now they got to revamp again. Now they finally get into a mindset of, we need a cavalry organization, and now they're still starting from scratch, and they're well behind their southern counterparts.
And that's actually maybe the point you're making is that it wasn't necessarily that the South dominated the cavalry side of things early in the war because they were better horsemen per se. You're saying that a large part maybe is that the North just knew the costs and the time needed and didn't focus on that. Because you're right, there's orders that at least I've run across, general orders, and there's letters and what is it? National Archives, letters to the Secretary of War, or I can't remember.
Adjutant General.
Yeah, just one of those microfilms. They basically said that we don't need that many. I know for the 11th Ohio and the 6th Ohio that I'm familiar with, when they were being mustered, there was a call off. So as they were being mustered, there was a big call off. Hey, we're not raising any more cavalry regiments, and they kind of, these companies over here that were supposed to be of this regiment, they just kind of threw them in and made one regiment because they just stopped early in the war. They just stopped recruiting. I get for this reason. So I guess what you're saying is that the North was behind the game because they didn't focus on it, and then when they realized, say, 62, of course, maybe 63, they realized, oh man, we do need a focus of cavalry, and they were all way behind the eight ball at that point in time. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think that's exactly the point. Is there
Okay.
once they finally go all in, they're so far behind their southern counterparts who gain the experience. Their officers have come up to speed. They're all, they're veterans by this point. They've worked out all the little problems that there's a lot of catching up to do. And the North would continue to make certain mistakes. And so, to your point with the 6th Ohio, let's say, and one I'm more familiar with be the 9th New York. These men came from certain areas with the idea they were going to stay from those areas. They went with a town unity, a state unity, a county unity, whatever it was. They fought with their friends and their neighbors, the men they mustered in with. And they had a loyalty. They were going to be writing back home. They were going to be writing letters to the newspapers back home. Well, now, if they're just all cast aside, it's nope, you're not going to be with that unit anymore. You're going to be over here. Well, you've lost that, and there goes your morale.
Oh, yeah.
So in the 9th New York, they did the same thing. They're going to take them all out, put them in the artillery and the infantry. These men didn't want that. They hadn't signed up for that. Imagine how we would feel today if...
Yeah.
And it's not to say the military doesn't do those things.
Yeah, I mean, how many stories
once
there,
you get in there,
MOS.
you're kind of at their mercy to an extent. But it doesn't mean we have to accept it very easily. And so the 9th, there was a major mutiny there. And they put a lot of men in prison for a long period of time because they go, oh, look, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
We came for the cavalry. We don't want to be artillerymen. We don't want to be infantrymen. And so and there were other things that had to be worked out. Volunteers, it was just to McClellan's point, didn't take to regular training. It became an issue through the war. They didn't take to regular Army discipline. They came up with one idea in mind, and when they came under a regular Army officer, they would mutiny.
Yeah.
1st Massachusetts has a mutiny in training camp because they're under regular Army discipline. They go, we didn't sign up for this.
Right.
We came here as volunteers to do a job, and we want to be able to elect our own officers or serve with our own officers. And that notion, again, created its own problems. So there's a lot of other things we can get into about the leadership, but I agree with your point there.
That's the next thing I'm going to talk about is, so, again, Whitaker goes into, again, his title, his chapter being organization. Then he goes into leadership of the Confederate cavalry and maybe, again, this other narrative of Civil War history that says the South lost because they are really effective, capable cavalry officers, basically through attrition, through dying off. They couldn't replace them either as quick and they couldn't replace them with as good leaders. In fact, he says here, but in the years of 1863 and 1864, the Confederate cavalry slowly waned as ours rose in luster. Morgan was taken, so was Gilmore. Stuart was killed, the flower of Southern cavalry, and to the old Southern cavalry leaders, none were found to succeed worthy to emulate those people's deeds. He says, even Mosby's ubiquitous band became less and less formidable daily, is what he said. So how much then, in the later part of the wars with the Federals becoming dominant on the cavalry service, was just due to poor leadership and the loss of, I guess, attrition through the Southern side? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's any question. He's on some pretty good ground there.
Yeah.
I think the South started out with young leadership in the cavalry. Jeb Stuart's a very young man.
Yeah.
He has a very engaging personality. He's a very charismatic man. He drew people to him. But we can get too far into that.
Yeah.
His personality turned off a lot of men.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of bitter enemies in his cavalry division, men that he fought with constantly and was constantly trying to get them out of there. So it's not this harmonious division that we sometimes get the impression it is, while the North was always struggling with their issues. But the younger leadership, I think, is just something to a younger mind. You're more willing to adapt to change.
Right.
So if you take McClellan, who was a relatively young man, but he will pick as one of his early cavalrymen uh, Philip St. George Cook, who happened to be Jeb Stuart's father-in-law.
Right.
A much older man, much more ingrained in a certain way of doing things. He'd had a lot of success in the antebellum army. He was a regular soldier through and through. He would argue and fight over the littlest things. It was the way he was brought up in the military. And I don't think he's is adaptable at his age as a man like Stuart is. Most of these men had never seen the amount of cavalry they were going to train or
Right.
lead either.
Yeah.
None of them had led this number of troops before. Most of them rarely had ever led a regiment. They were generally used to leading a company or a squadron or part of a regiment. And so there was a learning curve for all of them, and some did better and some did worse. And in the early years, the South excelled because they had the younger, more agile minds, I think. And as those men die off, those are the men that are getting promoted in the North.
Mm-hmm.
The North's problem was, to an extent, and this is not all the way across the board,
Right.
because it happened in the South as well. You would take a man of influence in a community, maybe a politician, maybe not, but a man of influence who had a connection to the governor or somebody at the state leadership, there was political patronage there.
Mm-hmm.
They could get themselves a colonel's commission with no background, not only in the cavalry, but in the military period. And no, other than the fact that they ran a store or they had a city position or political position or something like that, doesn't mean they were a great leader.
Right.
Moreover, they were all generally older men that were not going to be able to stand up to the rigors of cavalry work in the saddle for hours at a time. And you know that much better than I do. So those men would draw younger men in. It would get them to fill up a regiment.
Mm-hmm.
But then they found out that they couldn't lead. They couldn't stay in the saddle. And it took time to weed them out. You have McClellan, who in my mind is not of an aggressive bent. He's not really a cavalryman per se, although he'd done a lot of cavalry studies in Europe and the Crimea. He's not looking for the cavalry to be aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking for them to fill a certain role, very conservative role. The South's not. They're looking for their cavalry to be aggressive. So again, the Northern cavalry is kind of held on a short tether or short leash, reined in, where the South is kind of freewheeling and learning to do different things. Well, now you got to break that mold, and that takes time. And so those men will eventually realize one way or another, look, I've got to tap out here. I can't do this role as a colonel, or they would be relieved one way or another. And it took time to let the cream rise to the top, so to speak. Well, at the same time, the cream had risen earlier in the South, and they are going to become battle casualties. Right. And as happened in every army, men could be promoted beyond their ability.
Yeah.
So they could excel as a regimental commander or brigade commander, and then you get into larger command, and all of a sudden, you no longer excel. Throw in different things like the diminishing supply of horses in the South. You can get fewer men in the saddle. Their numbers are dropping. The North still is able to keep a full complement of men in the saddle. And all these disparities kind of start to change, the power structure on the battlefield.
No, so I mean, I completely agree, which is interesting because, again, going back to the chapter of organization, which I don't know if I would title it that. Again, his major focus to begin with is the idea of cavalry should be recruited from people who can ride and who already have horses, and then he goes into leadership being, the South again started failing because of their attrition of leadership, and then he continues on, and I find this interesting too. He actually makes another point of the failing Southern cavalry by saying, One cause of this change of the failing of one cause of this change was a falling off of horses in the South, by which the cavalry became weaker in numbers. But more than the weakness in numbers, it compelled the Southern cavalry leaders to be cautious and to husband their horses that could not be replaced. A cautious cavalryman soon becomes overcautious, timid for the safety of its horses, and the timidity of action is the bane of success. So again, this is just another brick on the idea of Southern failure and federal dominance later in the war. What are your thoughts on that then?
Again, I think I tend to agree. I think what
Yeah.
you see is a complete reversal of the roles.
Yeah.
Not only were Southern horses becoming harder to obtain, remember, generally speaking, a soldier had to go home and get his own horse. So if you're fighting in the Jeb Stuart's cavalry division, you lose a horse and you're from
Right.
the
Yeah.
Jeff
Exactly.
Davis Legion and home is in Mississippi, it's going to take you a while to get home.
Right.
And you don't know that there's going to be a horse there or not. So you have a couple of choices. You can hope you can walk along with your mounted friends and capture a horse, or you're going to take time to go to Mississippi. And going to Mississippi would mean maybe you're open to capture along the route.
Right.
When you get home, maybe it's time for the crop to come in, and your parents are there to plead with you to stay a little while longer, so you don't go back to the army as quickly as you might have otherwise. Horses, the deflation or inflation of the Southern dollar meant that horses were costing thousands of dollars in the South by the midpoint of the war. So it was, in a lot of ways, it's beyond the realm of the average soldier to buy another horse.
Right.
So all these things, and if there's something to what he's saying about becoming timid or husbanding your strength, well, then you're going back to what the Northern cavalry was doing in the early war,
Right,
and they were being cautious,
Right.
for different reasons, but you still wind up with the same result. And so I agree by and large with what he's saying there.
So one thing I also find is interesting. We actually talked about this just before we started this video. He said later, kind of in his closing statements, he said, "In fact, the whole of the disasters of McClellan and Pope in 1862 might have been averted had we possessed good cavalry, but practically we had none." He says, "What there was scattered among corps and division infantry commanders who knew nothing of its use and who heartily disliked it. The infantrymen sneered at it, and the universal opinion was that cavalry was useless except for outposts and orderly duty. In fact, to look at the enemy and run away." Now, just again, earlier on this morning, we talked about how the infantry, or maybe it was yesterday, I can't remember now, it's a long couple days, but the idea of there were a couple moments where infantry were able to see cavalry engage and fight and combat, and it was kind of surprising what they saw. So, again, just kind of expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that gets overused a little bit. Yes, McClellan scattered his cavalry out a good bit, and you do have this large bodies of couriers and escorts, and McClellan liked to have his big headquarters flourishing guard around him with their guidons and pennants fluttering and what have you, and it all looked good, but the infantrymen who were sustaining the majority of the casualties look at this and go, we're not seeing any sharing here of the threat on the battlefield. And that would change when they actually got to see them fighting, but it's also, I think, overdrawn a little bit. Especially in the Second Manassas campaign, there are at least three brigades of cavalry organized as brigades of multiple regiments that are very active during the Second Manassas campaign as cavalrymen. They're covering the rear guard of the army. They're covering the advance of the army. There's a lot of back and forth in Culpeper County where the Battle of Brandy Station is going to take place in June of 1863 and later on in the year. Well, there's a battle there in August of 62. So their cavalry, it gets too easy to shutter them aside like they're doing nothing. A lot of other issues come into cavalrymen. You got to get supplies to them. You got to take care of your horses. You got to be able to feed your horses. And that's a lot of work. That's part of the reason the North didn't want to raise cavalrymen or cavalry regiments. They knew the burden this was going to be, not just to raise them in the expense, but to maintain them. And so you get into a very hot summer of 1862, they're being used very hard as cavalrymen on long patrols, long reconnaissances. They're doing cavalry work, and it's wearing out the horses. They're not able to get food to them in sufficient quantities and things like that. The men haven't learned to take care of their horses yet. They're not being forced to take care of their horses. So that's the leadership issue there, which we can get into more in a little bit if you want.
Yeah, definitely.
But so it's there. I think Pope actually, to my mind, gets a little bit of a short shrift that he was using. He was actually overusing his cavalry as cavalry. Would be, I think, a better argument.
Go into that. I guess, what do you mean by overusing cavalry as cavalry?
Well, because he didn't know where the attacks are coming from. When he's sent in to essentially the Piedmont area, into Culpeper County and what have you, he's got McClellan's army still down on the peninsula. You've got troops coming out of the Shenandoah Valley. He's trying to figure out where the enemy's going to come at him from. What's going to happen with McClellan. So he's got to send these constant patrols out over rather long distances in very difficult heat, Virginia heat. And so that just goes on and on and on as he's being constantly trying to figure out where he can go, how far he can advance. And as he goes out, that means his supply lines are getting longer. So it's going to take him longer to get supplies, bring forage up for his horses and things like that. So there's a lot there that you can't just dismiss with an easy sentence that Pope didn't know what he was doing with his cavalry.
It's too easy to dismiss leaders who have bad reputation, especially from armchair historians.
Right. So Pope comes up with a bad reputation. He's a blusterer, and he makes a lot of bold claims early on that people like to throw back at him still all these years later. But he put his cavalry out there to do a lot of cavalry work, did a lot of cavalry fighting. They protect the army in the advance and the retreat. So that is diminished, I think, too quickly. But that doesn't mean there's still not a lot of work to be done in these cavalry regiments in terms of leadership. There's still issues of, I think, leadership through the ranks, but especially the company level, the lieutenants and the captains that really need to learn to be leaders yet.
Well, so actually, let's go ahead and go into that. Like you kind of alluded to it just a few minutes ago. The idea of, again, from the federal standpoint of officers being recruited because they talked enough friends into coming in with them. How do you think that affected the discipline of the federal cavalry?
I think it doesn't instill any discipline. So
how do you guys go into that?
So what we were talking about is that officers came into their positions several different ways. So in Michigan, I have some experience in looking at the records of the governor, the letters that men would write. If you brought in a certain number of men to the ranks, so let's say the 5th Michigan Cavalry is being recruited in the summer of 1862, the fall of 1862, you want to go in and you want to be an officer. Your father wants you to be an officer. Well, you could write a letter to the governor. Your father could write a letter to the governor and say, look, my son's a very bright young man. He would like a lieutenant's commission, and I think he can bring X number of men with him into the ranks with him. Well, those men, if he gets that, he owes his commission in a sense to those 20 men or so that he brings with him. And they now know that he owes them for that.
Right.
And they're all friends from home. They all grew up together, went to school together, worked together, whatever. It makes it harder to discipline those men.
Very much so, yeah.
And as we all know from whatever our point in life is now, not everyone comes to a leadership role easily. It has to be learned, and some never learn it.
Yeah.
There's a point in time when you have to instill discipline. You have to make the men do something they don't want to do.
And yeah, exactly.
And that is what it would take a long time to learn.
And actually, I mean, I think that's an awesome point because, again, from my own experience in my life, we have we had a problem on the fire department with basically guys who would grow up, would be recruited with us. We go through academy together, and then one of us would get promoted over the other, and that became an issue because at that point in time, it's on him to discipline and we know all his failures, and we know where he broke the rules when he was a probationary firefighter. And there's actually a really good book called Buddy to Boss out there that really talks about this problem in a modern context. And I think human behavior hasn't changed. In thousands of years. And I think the problem that we have now with, buddies coming together in a very stressful situation, and then other people being promoted in those wartime combat or I guess in my case, emergency response situations. And then there's an issue there with discipline because you feel like you can't discipline your friends. And I think back then it was the same issue.
Saw the same thing in the police department. You
Yeah.
got the same exact thing.
Yeah.
So it still continues. The other thing in both sides, the South did the same thing. A lot of their officers were elected by the men.
Right. Yeah.
So in terms of they didn't necessarily get a commission directly from the governor. They would hold regimental elections at certain levels.
Right.
So again, the result is the same though. You owe your position to the men you are supposed to be leading and disciplining, and that makes it hard to do that. Well, if you think of all the things, and I'm going to read you some examples here that I hope will make this point. If you have to, there's so many more things that a cavalryman had to do. He had to take care of his horse. He had to groom his horse. He had to go to water his horse every morning. A lot of this had to be done before they took care of themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
But when they came in off a long patrol, if they're not made to do it, human nature being what it is, they will take care of themselves and get it in the reverse order.
Very much so, yeah.
Well, an officer had to make them do that, but he was just as tired as they were coming in off patrol. So until the Army, and this happens in my mind in February of 1863, there's a specific point I think you can point to. When Joseph Hooker, then the Army commander, just literally has had enough. And he says, basically, I am paraphrasing here, but I will fire every man from general down. Things have got to change. And they begin doing that. They begin letting men go who have been captured without even a chance to defend themselves. They don't even wait till they're brought back on exchange or parole.
Like while they're in prison.
While they're in prison, no means
fired.
of defending themselves.
Yeah.
They are dismissed from the Army by the President of the United States. And they have to go home in disgrace. Men are fired for other reasons that they're not even in prison camp. They're still not allowed to defend themselves. That's the discipline from the top down that the men started to realize, wait a minute, all right, now we're playing for keeps. Hooker said, if you have to get killed, you have to get killed. Yeah. But this is war.
Yeah.
And that's part of what happens in war. And if I have to fire y'all, I'm going to fire y'all. Yeah. And we're going to find who can lead. And that's when it starts to change. They realize it's not going to be business as usual.
So you're saying that when Hooker made that order, I guess basically instilled a level of accountability into the Cavalry Corps at that point in time. You're saying that's, for you, that's the point in time in which the Northern Cavalry started becoming superior then.
Yep. After the fight at Hartwood Church in February of 1863, he's done everything. He gets more credit, I think, than he deserves for the formation of the Cavalry Corps. Yeah. That's a political decision that comes down from Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. But still, he's saying, look, I gave you your identity. You all wanted this. You wanted to come to the table at the same level as the infantrymen. You've got a corps command now. You're under a cavalryman, and you're still failing. Yeah. This has got to change. And that's when you start to see, and it happens pretty quickly, I believe.
Yeah, interesting. So basically in closing then, so he actually Whitaker closed out the chapter by then reverting back to his discussion of a civilian cavalry corps that is based off of owners of their horses. Not really focusing on his closing statements. What do you think, from an organizational standpoint, separated the Confederates from the Federals in the beginning of the war, and then kind of summing up what we talked about, and then separating the Federals from the Confederates later on in the war? What do you think was the 2 or 3 key pieces?
Well, it would be summing up what we've already discussed. Yeah. I think it's first and foremost, it's leadership and the mindset of the leadership. That the South knew the leadership, the political leadership even, was behind them in terms of the cavalry. They were going to support the cavalry to go out and do what cavalrymen did.
Right.
The North didn't see that. Everything to the trooper level, as they looked up the chain, they saw them being diminished, being shunted aside. We're not coming in with the same expectations. We're not being challenged. We're not being asked to do the same things. And so they become, for lack of a better word, lazy. You fall back to what, if that's all they want me to do, then I'm not going to work at excelling. And so that really is to me the key. And once that starts to change, then other things happen. And a lot of things that we talked about earlier, more weapons coming online, other things, the supply chain gets better.
Right.
So all the things that took a while to establish, the supply chain, the quartermaster and all that, there's a lot of time getting contracts established.
Right.
We can go off on
takes
a whole
time,
other
yeah.
tangent.
That's a whole other thing.
So
yeah.
all that helps come in. Well, in the South, that's starting to all diminish.
Right.
If they even really had it to start with.
And that's a whole other
So
argument, yeah.
there's a lot of other things, but there's so much coming in that plays a role in how that changes.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate you joining us again. Again, hope you guys like this. Please like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook. And of course, join us for our next episode, discovering, or I guess getting into more Whitaker chapters and lessons of a decade. So thanks, Bob. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.